In the next hour and a bit, what I would love to do is give you a practical theological reading on the book of Joel, which hopefully will give you 6 specific sermons that you can preach. And my challenge would be for all of you is if you find yourself in a position where you can regularly preach Joel. I can guarantee you will touch every person personally who listens to you. It will make a difference in their lives, and you will invite them into a much larger narrative that they may be lacking. Joel came to me sort of in a very fortuitous sense. About 17 years ago, I arrived in Michigan, the first place where I taught. And like all seminary professors, I was invited a lot to preach at other churches. What do you preach to a community that you see only once? And you don't have a keen sense of what's happening here, what's happening there, and then you walk away. And I have no relationship with this community. I cannot speak with a sense of trust or mutuality. None of those things existed. And so it was in that time that I read Denise Ackerman's book, After the Locusts. And if you have never read that book, After the Locusts, you definitely want to read it. It is Denise Ackerman's view on the locust of apartheid. And she tries to communicate to her children some of the choices that she made in life. Choices that hurt her personally, that hurt the family in some ways. And so after reading the book of Joel through the lens of Ackerman, it dawned upon me that this is the one book that I can preach to every congregation at any time, and it doesn't matter who sits in front of me. I know it will impact their life, and I know it will make a difference, even if it's only a tiny one, small one. So my challenge to you then is to preach Joel, which is an absolute neglected book in all of Scripture. And we can talk a little bit more about that maybe later on. So I said towards the end of our last session that to live the good life, you need a narrative to live into. You need a story that can guide your life. And I gave the 5 traits of millennials. But actually those traits coincide or intersect, dovetail, in an amazing way with the story we find in Joel. So if I can summarize Joel, this is what it would look like. There was a person who knew loss and trauma. The person mourned the losses and sought healing for personal traumas by building life-giving communities and nurturing his or her spirituality. The person discovered the compassionate God who promises restoration and pours God's Spirit over all. The persons embraced accountability, knowing that decisions made and actions taken have consequences. The person participated in God's restorative work toward a just society and a sustainable earth. The person lived the good life. This is the narrative that I think every one of us should live into. This is the narrative that I think millennials naturally drift towards. Because as I've shared, the very traits and concerns that they bring dovetail beautifully with this narrative. Now, the narrative then, I've said, is not mine, and it's not the millennial narrative either for millennials. It's the story of Joel. Brueggemann already reminded us a number of years ago that if we believe in the prophetic imagination, change will happen. Hope will set in. And so we have to tap into the prophets in amazing kind of ways. I deeply appreciate when he says the expression of new realities against the more visible ones of the old order. Can we see the new vision coming that millennials may be bringing to us? Or are we going to hold on to the old order? That's the challenge that we are facing. Now, the book of Joel, just sort of as an introduction, is an amazing book. What I like the most about the book is that we know so little about it. We know just about nothing, really. This is how Scripture begins. The Lord's word that came to Joel, Pethuel's son. And then we discover we have absolutely no clue who's Pethuel. Never mentioned in Scripture anywhere but here. And in a cultural tradition where genealogy is really important, son of, he's just a nobody. Nobody knows who Joel is. But we do know that his name means Yahweh is God. We know a couple of things that we deduce from the text. We know that he probably lived around Jerusalem. We know that he engaged farmers quite a bit because he engaged a farming community often. And we have metaphors of wine and destroyed crops. We know that. We know very little of when the book was written. It seems as if the majority of scholars would say, yeah, maybe around 586 after the fall of the temple. That's the majority, but probably a third, if not more, of scholars will place him 400 years earlier. Now, I like the fact that the book may have been sort of written over a 500-year span. There's something good about the mystery of Joel. Of course, one of the minor prophets, and if you look at many commentaries now in the last couple of years, and it's in your reference list, some amazing commentaries on the book of Joel that has come out. But almost always, Joel is wedged in with 3 or 4 other prophets. And the whole commentary is only this long, as if Joel doesn't have much to say in our world today. What is wonderful about the book is that you can see two distinct sections. The first half is pretty despairing to read. The second half is very hopeful. The musicians, when they wrote songs about the first couple of chapters, came back and they said, do we really have to write songs where there's no hope? And I said, of course, because that's what the text is. We can talk about that a little bit later, but we in the Christian faith has done so much on hope. I write in the Millennial Narrative that maybe we can learn more about hopelessness where hope is not present. And we can talk about that maybe after lunch, after that section, okay? Other things that I love about the book is that it's Joel must have had some control issues because he loved giving commands, more so than any other book in Scripture. My wife will say she knows exactly why the book is my favorite. But it's a demanding kind of book. But it's more so, there's a lot of other things that's in the book that is really powerful. For instance, most scholars do not even agree on what the book is all about. There's this open-endedness, this mysteriousness to this book. where seasoned scholars just keep wondering, what is this? Is this a lament? Is this theodicy? Is this a vision about the future? Are we talking about real events or just imaginary events? All of those questions are unanswered. Scholars just do not know. It is phenomenal to think that we have a book that's part of our scripture, and folks just do not know, even as they study the text. Two things that I think make this book special, of special value for the millennial generation, is the bullet I just posted, which Joel is the only prophet that does not care about Israel's sin. It's the only prophet that does not show Israel or where they went wrong. There is a return to God portion that I will give you, but the return to God is you return to God after the locusts devoured your life. It's not because you're sinful. It's because of the locusts. That's why you return. It is a wonderful book because there's a lot of promise and a lot of a sort of encouragement. And then what I appreciate about Joel 2 is that if we accept the date of 500s plus, if we accept the fact that maybe this book was written when the temple was destroyed, and it now shows new forms of worship, new forms of life that can come forward, that means that the church does not have to be so anxious to protect its existing structures. Maybe in the newness that comes, that's where the true reformation is happening. And it's not just changing what we have today. It is a wonderful, wonderful book to work at, that we are reminded by Jerome many, many years ago, that it is a story that is mysterious, but it invites us into a world where we can recognize ourselves. And that is the book of Joel, a book we know so little about. I'm not surprised that many of us never preach about the book of Joel, because what do you say if you don't know? It's a wonderful, wonderful book. So what makes this an amazing, why does my clicker not want to work? What makes this an amazing a book is that it comes in very distinct acts. There are 6 moments in the book of Joel that the one is as clear as daylight, different from the others. And in the Millennial Narrative, what I do is every act, which I'm going to give you, is another chapter. For you and for me, that would be another sermon that we can do. And I just want to take 1 second here, and I think the antenna doesn't want to discover what I do. See if this works better if I do it this way. So 6 different acts, okay? Act 1. I'm not going to read every passage, but I do want to read the first one because it's beautiful. This is what we hear. The Lord's word came to Joel, Pethuel's son. Hear this, elders. Pay attention, everyone in the land. Has anything like this ever happened in your days or in the days of your ancestors? Tell it to your children, and have your children tell their children, and their children tell their children. What the cutting locust left, the swarming locust has eaten. And what the swarming locust left, the hopping locust has eaten. What the hopping locust left, the devouring locust has eaten. Scripture goes on, lament like a woman dressed in funeral clothing, one who has lost the husband of her youth. The grain offering and the drink offering are gone from the Lord's temple. The priests and the Lord's ministers mourn. The grapevine is dried up. The fig tree withers. Pomegranate and palm and apple. All the trees of the field are dried up. Joy fades away from the people. This is a phenomenal opening salvo. What is so sad about translations is that I described the hopping locust and the swarming locust, but we stayed within locusts. But that actually is not what the Hebrew is suggesting. If we look more carefully at the text, we have two different kinds of locusts. There's the chazam and the yelek. The chazam and the yelek. And they were not even locusts, they were worms. They were cankerworms and palmer worms. They were caterpillars. Joel begins with this image that there is catastrophe coming your way. It's inching its way towards you at the speed of a caterpillar. But it will catch you. And it is going to devour you. And there's nothing you can do to stop it. So that's the chazam and the yelek, okay? Then there's the chasil and the arbe. Chasil and the arbe, which is actually the fast-moving locust. It's a locust that can move 100 miles in one day. Joel begins by saying, there's that crisis that will come in with a phone call. And when that phone call comes in, your life is going to be changed forever. Joel comes in and says, you're going to go on a date. And you're going to think it's going to be a wonderful evening because you're a teenager and you're out on a date. And that night, you're one of the many, many girls that's the victim of a date rape. It comes fast. It comes out of nowhere. The result, however, is exactly the same. Devoured lands and landscapes. I have not met any person yet who cannot associate with the slow-moving crisis or who cannot associate with the fast-moving crisis that surprises you. The church knows these crises too. It's the crisis that we can see membership is just on the decline. And like the caterpillar, we know it's going to catch up with us. Then there is that front page newspaper like we had yesterday in the report. Shocking. And it just removes worlds of confidence and trust. We know both. But that is how Joel begins. This is then the irony, that if you and I would like to invite people into the good life, this is where we begin. Why? Because you have immediate emotional connection with the other person. If I ask you, you don't know me well, but I am really curious about what traumas have touched your life already that has impacted your life in profound ways. Can you tell me about that? You have immediate connection with the other person. Joel, thank God, moves on. He stays with the locust, and then he moves up to a profound new act. The command that Joel gives is gather. Come together. He actually says there are three ways of how you respond to the locusts of life. The one is you lament. The second one is you gather. And the third one is you try to discover the compassionate God who restores. It's the God that every person longs for. So gathering is just absolutely amazing. In Joel's language, call a sacred assembly. Do something special in reaction to the losses that took place. For Joel, it is when we gather, when we come together, that we discover the compassionate God. The God of Joel is the most beautiful God that we can offer anyone. It is the God who is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in love. It's the God who does not send calamity. It's the God who will repay you for the years that the locusts have eaten. So now you can see that we are already within the Acts of Joel. We are right at that point where we are taking a turn from despair to hope. I'm amazed sometimes at what people believe God would be as a person. But in my experience, and as I read studies on people's God images, the most profound image that people have of God is the God who takes careful note of everything I do wrong and then will punish me for what I have done. That is by far the most common view that people have of God. And of course, they got it from pulpits, they got it from teachers, they got it from tele-evangelists, they got it from many spaces. But that God is far removed from the God of Joel. Actually, because God is gracious and compassionate, because God is slow in anger, we need not fear accountability. We need not fear accountability. This God not only repays us for the years that the locusts have eaten, this God comes and says, I will repay you for the years, and then afterwards, I will pour out my Spirit on all people. This is a phenomenal text because the all is repeated quite often, actually. It's not just that some people have God's Spirit, people like us. All people. And what I really enjoy about our text is God breaks down hierarchies by including daughters, by including older men and women, by including servants. God is breaking down hierarchies that we create. So where a person started with locusts that took away a flourishing life, we are now already at a point where God's vital force, because the word for spirit is ruach, it's wind, it is life force, where it's now poured out over this devoured person that we had. The fifth act is the most troubling for scholarship. Because if you look at most commentaries on the book of Joel, they will say that the essence of Joel is the day of the Lord. And the day of the Lord, for most people, is a day of profound judgment. I'm going to come back with how we can work with the day of the Lord maybe differently. What's intriguing about that fifth act of Joel is that it's not Israel or Judah that's being judged. It is actually the people who took Israel into exile that's being judged. It's not God's people. Because the loving, compassionate God is our God, we need not fear the day of the Lord. And then, to me, probably the most beautiful image that we have in Scripture is the book ends with this image that water flows from God's throne and nurtures the valley of acacias out there. It is God's blessing that flows from us into the world. And that actually summarizes all that Joel is all about. It's 73 verses. There's not that many verses. We have showed actually a good number of those 73. But 6 distinct acts that we can draw upon in the book of Joel.